Before we get started, a quick warning. This episode contains strong language, descriptions of violence, and gay slurs. It also mentions suicide. It may not be appropriate for all listeners.
The verdicts just come in for the killings of George Moscone and Harvey Milk, voluntary manslaughter on both counts.
For assassinating two public officials, Dan White was facing less than 8 years in prison. With good behavior, the former cop turned firefighter could get out in 5. His argument that he'd lost control of his emotions, in part because of all the Twinkies he ate, had convinced a jury of his peers. Harvey Milk's intern, Cleve Jones, was gobsmacked. But he pulled himself together enough to share a message with a television reporter.
That's when I said the reaction will be tonight. If you care about justice, come to Castro Street now. And then I went back to my apartment to get the bullhorn.
That bullhorn had a history.
Harvey spoke through many bullhorns over his career, but he only owned one. And it was the one that was given to him by the Teamsters in recognition of his leadership in the Coors beer boycott. It has a rather prominent dent which came from a police baton at a Teamsters picket line. And then when he got elected, he gave it to me. And he said, I'm going to be inside, you're going to be outside screaming.
Cleve had screamed into that bullhorn at all the marches he'd led in San Francisco over the past year, protesting gay rights defeats across the nation. Now, as the crowd started to build, Cleve took the bullhorn back out and did what Harvey had taught him. Feel what the crowd was feeling and put those emotions into words.
I think today is a really terrible day for the gay people of San Francisco. And I'd like to see us move down to 18th Street and start it from there and get the people out of the bars and into the streets.
By the time the sun had set, thousands of people had gathered at the intersection of Castro and Market.
Out of the bars, into the street, out of the bars.
From every street, you could see people just running, and some had signs, "Avenge Harvey Milk." You can't even call it a march. It was just a mob roaring down Market Street, screaming bloody murder. Dan White was a cop. Dan White was a cop.
Cleve's plan was to do what he'd done at all those other protests, march them till they drop. Get people out of the Castro and tire them out before they could burn down the neighborhood.
This was the plan. This was the plan we thought we were going to use after we lost the Briggs initiative. We won Prop 6, so we didn't have to do it. But it was a well-established route of march. Most of the people had done it before. So we get to City Hall, and I'm thinking, we're just going to sweep past it.
That's how it usually went. But this time, they ran into something unexpected. A group of radical lesbians had already posted up at City Hall. They were holding their own rally about race and the death penalty, talking about how black prisoners get executed while Dan White gets a light sentence and eventually a chance at freedom.
There's a generator and a sound system and a stage and these lesbians. And then the people stopped. And I'm thinking, uh-oh, we're not going to just move on.
The crowd was already agitated, and the tension started to escalate.
Police have arrived at City Hall, at the doors of City Hall. They've got riot squad gear on.
San Francisco police officers filed in front of the building. In the process, they knocked over the generator, cutting out the sound system. Everyone who'd marched down from the Castro was now fuming in place, chanting, "All straight jury, no surprise. Dan White lives and Harvey dies."
So we had an angry mob, cops positioning themselves basically as targets right there.
People were milling around in front of City Hall, thousands and thousands and thousands of people.
Lesbian activist Ruth Mahaney had rushed down as soon as she heard the verdict.
A lot of angry people, and there was no sound system.
Without a real sound system, no one could calm down the crowd.
So some rocks start flying, some windows get broken.
I tried to throw a rock, but it was never a softball dike, and my rock didn't go very far, didn't hit anything.
I was pretty much freaking out. A lot of people are chanting, "No more violence, no more violence." Which people, when they see the footage, they often think they're talking about no more violence against gay people. And no, this was gay people saying no more violence. Most of the people there didn't want to riot.
A couple of leaders of the lesbian community came up and said, "Ruth, this is going to turn into a riot." And I said, "Uh-huh." And they said, "You have to stop it." I looked around, there were thousands of people there. I said, "I have to stop it?" I said, "First of all, I don't want to stop it. And secondly, I can't stop it."
And then Amber Hollabaugh gets the bullhorn.
I talked about Amber Hollabaugh in a previous episode. She was the high femme working class lesbian who drove out to small towns to talk to voters about Proposition 6.
Amber stood up on the steps of City Hall and gave an amazing speech.
It's time we stood up for each other. That's what Harvey meant to us. He wasn't some big leader. He was one of us.
We have a right to be angry. This was not justice.
I don't think it's wrong for us to feel like we do. I think we should feel like it more often. Don't you listen to anybody that tells you you don't need to fight back, but they'll get you killed.
And then all hell broke loose.
This is Slow Burn, Gays Against Briggs. I'm your host, Christina Cauterucci. On May 21st, 1979, the day before what would have been Harvey Milk's birthday, San Francisco's gay community was boiling with rage. They'd witnessed the assassination of an up-and-coming leader who'd promised them a brighter gay future, and they'd seen his killer get treated like he was the victim. It seemed like there was only one explanation. In California, in 1979, taking a gay life wasn't seen as murder at all.
If Dan White had not killed a homosexual, he would have gone to the gas chamber.
Gay activists had spent the last 2 years following the rules. They'd engaged with homophobes in respectful debates. They'd sought justice against John Briggs at the ballot box. They'd peacefully mourned Harvey Milk on the night of his killing. Now, the insult was too massive to swallow, and they were done playing nice.
I think they should burn down the whole place. The city government isn't representing us. We can burn it down and we'll make it again.
This is our season finale. Turn around, fight back. What's the one thing most history books all over the world have in common? They're seriously lacking in the melanin department. Wondery's podcast Black History for Real introduces you to the most overlooked Black history makers you should already know about. In recent episodes, they've told the story of the women of the Black Panther Party, like Assata Shakur, who's still a fugitive in exile, and Elaine Brown, the first female chairperson of the party. And there's so much more, like why a young Samuel L. Jackson got expelled from Morehouse College, and why country music keeps trying to keep Beyoncé out. Follow Black History for Real on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to Black History for Real early and ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus. Discover more to the story with Wondery's other top history podcasts, including American History Tellers, Legacy, and even The Royals. On the night of the Dan White verdict, thousands of furious gay people filled the streets of San Francisco, most of them anticipating a peaceful protest. When one part of the crowd looked like it might storm City Hall, other demonstrators locked arms to try to guard it. But if there was any chance that the tension would ease and the crowd would move along, it evaporated when the San Francisco police tried to seize control.
Cops are now bashing heads of the people who had formed a human chain to protect City Hall.
The police dragged away that chain of protesters in an attempt to protect the building. Immediately, other demonstrators rushed up to the doors.
These guys I knew, these mild-mannered guys, like bartenders and barbers and bus drivers are like ripping the grillwork off the front of it and using it as rams to break through.
Were you still trying to stop things at this point?
I wanted to, but I what can you do when there's no sound system?
Someone, and I believe it's Cleve Jones, is trying to talk through a bullhorn, and I can barely hear him saying, Harvey hated violence, please, no violence. But now the crowd is screaming, Dan White's a pig.
Police are now moving out into the crowd. Moving out into the crowd and just flailing about.
The police have literally beaten the crowd.
Gay people are carrying gay people away who have been hurt.
More police started to roll in, and they got organized.
So then the police formed a wedge, and they decided to get people away from City Hall.
The riot squad was there with the helmets and the shields and the batons. They marched in formation into the crowd. And they do this thing where they grunt loudly and stamp their feet and beat their shields with their batons and make these extremely intimidating. It's like suddenly you're up against the Roman Empire.
You know, marching every step of the way. So they were trying to divide the crowd. And they suddenly couldn't go any further because people sat down.
In the 1970s, sitting down and staying down was a popular tactic at anti-nuclear protests. People would just take a seat and wait for the police to carry them away. But on this night, that wasn't going to work.
Other people surrounded them and said, wait, it's not that kind of demonstration. It's more like the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations where they actually beat people. These cops are really mad and they're going to hurt you.
The police weren't just angry because Dan White was one of them. They were also mad because their chief was a liberal. He'd been hired by the other man White had killed, Mayor George Moscone, and the chief had a mandate to ease tensions between gay people in the police department. Now, the chief was trying to keep his officers on a tight leash. Their orders were to just stay by City Hall and protect the building. But that's not what some of them did.
The police moved into a group of people who were sitting down and not moving and just clubbed away. And they realized that obviously our nonviolent not moving was not going to work.
People flipped out, frightened, because half the people there weren't there for a fight. There's tear gas being shot at us, and we're being attacked by these guys, and they're in rigid formation. So people panic and start running. People are going to get crushed. This is a stampede. People are going to get killed.
Cleve had started out that night pleading for calm. But now he was beginning to change his mind.
I don't think anybody wants violence except for a few extreme, crazy people. But I think there was just a sense that it had to happen.
Why?
Because Dan White was a cop. That's what it boiled down to. It was the power of the state was being used against us, and they had killed Harvey. That's a simplification, and maybe it's not even true historically, but that's how we took it. Dan White was a cop. The cops hate us. The cops are trying to hurt us now. They were the enforcers of the laws that up until very recently had been putting people in prison. They were entrapping us, they were beating us, they were insulting us. So suddenly there's this opportunity to punch the bully in the face and draw blood. And I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it felt good.
Cleve was with his friend, gay activist Bill Krause. At this point, they both tried to get the crowd to stop stampeding. Usually, Cleve would get on his bullhorn, but he'd lost it somewhere in the riot. So he and Bill just started screaming.
Slow down. Don't run. And people up and down the plaza picked up the chant. Slow down, don't run. Slow down, don't run. And then we said, turn around. Slow down, don't run. Turn around. Slow down, don't run. Turn around, fight back. Slow down, don't run. Turn around, fight back. This whole mob of terrified thousands of people that had been running and fleeing suddenly just stopped running, turned around, And you saw all these completely unarmed protesters just throwing themselves at the police.
The police, they looked at each other, and I could see them. They were terrified. They realized that they were now totally surrounded by thousands of demonstrators. And they turned around, and the crowd just automatically opened up a pathway for them, and they went running out. It was almost like a choreographed scene that we were performing, that we knew how to do it. And I thought, wow, that means to me that back in those anti-war days, there were a lot of gay people there. And it was the first time that I really realized that there were tons of gay people in all the movements that I've been involved in, but we weren't out. And so people didn't know gay people were there, but we were there.
After the protesters surrounded them, the cops retreated on foot, leaving behind their police cars.
About 12 to 14 of them along one side of the plaza.
All in this neat row.
The windows were all down. And so people began to throw burning paper into the police cars.
And we burned them all.
A barricade of newspaper racks and trash dumpsters has been set on fire. 4 police cars in a row burning on this end of McAllister Street, 2 burning down the other end.
As a demonstrator set one of the cars on fire, he yelled to a nearby reporter, "Make sure you put in the paper that I ate too many Twinkies." All the police could do was stand back and watch.
I heard them talking to each other about who has the keys to the cars because they saw that they were being burned. And nobody knew who had the keys.
Did you set any cars on fire?
Yeah, I threw a book of burning matches into a police car, but it went out. And so that's the extent of what I managed to do. I did learn that if you really want to set something on fire, you have to set something like newspaper on fire and then put the newspaper on the thing you want to burn. So that's my lesson from that experience.
The mayhem was now radiating out from City Hall into the surrounding neighborhoods. Cleve and his friend Bill were in the thick of it, and they wanted to do their fair share.
Bill looks at me and he said, "Have you ever broken a window?" We've got tear gas in our eyes, we're out of breath. There's fire and smoke and explosions going on. And I swear we were giggling. And I said, "No, I never have." And he said, "Me neither. Do you want to?" And I said, "Well, if we were ever going to break a window, that would be the window right there."
It was a big plate glass panel on the side of a Bank of America branch. Bill couldn't resist. He found a rock and hurled it.
It bounced off, which I found somehow just hilariously funny. And I said, "You're such a sissy." And so I picked up the rock and I threw it as hard as I could against the window, and it bounced off. And at this point, we're both convulsing with laughter. And then this big butch dyke pulls up, and she takes a garbage can, pulls it up over her head, and throws it through the window, smashing it. And I just ran.
By now, people who hadn't been a part of the original march, people who weren't even gay, had heard about the riot on the news and shown up just to act out. Cleve could see it was time to get out of there. A lesbian he knew managed to pick him up on her motorcycle and drove him back to his apartment in the Castro. Ruth was ready to leave too, if she could find a way out.
My car was parked very close to the burning police cars. It had all the windows broken out because of the fire department. And my car was filled with water, but it still ran.
She started to drive away, her feet totally submerged.
By that time, there were people blocking all the intersections and stuff, so people were like jumping on my car, and I said, "But I'm a demonstrator, let me through, please."
As Ruth steered through the chaos, she watched police officers grab people who were trying to leave the scene and just start beating them.
There were taxi drivers who were circling the area, and they would see someone being wailed on by the police, pull up, jump out, grab the guy who was being beaten, throw him in his cab, and drive him to the hospital. Taxi drivers that night saved people.
Ruth did eventually make it home to the Castro. She thought her night was over, but the riots were just beginning. We'll be right back.
When I first got here, I was really disappointed because the Castro was really dead.
Earlier this year, I met Ruth Mahaney in the Castro at the exact spot where she ended up after the riot at City Hall. Like literally this corner where we are right now.
This is the corner, yeah. And I couldn't believe the difference. I had all this adrenaline, I just left the scene, and I couldn't believe that people here weren't even aware of what was going on. And I realized it was all the people who didn't want to be at the riot were here, and they were quietly drinking in the bars.
After she got to the Castro, Ruth called a friend from a phone booth to let them know she was safe. As she was standing there, a public bus pulled up across the street. It looked totally empty, except for the driver.
And the driver got out, ran around to the side of the bus and hit it twice, and up jumped an entire tax squad in full riot gear. They had been lying on the seats, I guess. They filed out of the bus and into this intersection right here.
They were really close to you.
Yeah. They lined up in the middle of the street. Traffic began to build up on all four ways here. So people immediately came pouring out of the bars.
Everyone wanted to see what was going on and to stop the police from invading the Castro. They started yelling. Go home! Go home! Go home! Go home! Cleve Jones was in his apartment nearby. His friend across the hall had a window looking out onto Castro Street.
And he came and knocked on the door. He said, "You need to come see this." And we went into his living room in the bay window, and we looked out, and the cops were coming to Castro, a lot of them.
The officers started running at all the people gathered on the sidewalks, swinging their nightsticks.
They just charged really fast into the crowd I was in. I then ran up the hill. At one point, I had slowed down thinking they were no longer behind me, but, a cop was still chasing.
Finally, the officer gave up the chase. Ruth caught her breath and looked behind her.
And then I heard just blood-curdling screaming going on a block down from me.
The cops were going wild. Now it was their turn to riot.
And they make a big line, and they just swept down Castro Street and beat the shit out of everybody they encountered.
They charged up all the way up our stairs and in right to our front door, forcing us into the house with a weapon. There were officers with drawn rifles.
The San Francisco police were primed to revolt because they hated the liberal chief that George Moscone had brought in, because some of their own had gotten injured that night, because they felt a kinship with Dan White, and because a lot of them hated gay people. That night, it wasn't just the cops from that one public bus who descended on the Castro. Hundreds of officers in riot gear rampaged into what had been a peaceful neighborhood. A reporter overheard a police captain say, "We lost the battle at City Hall. We aren't going to lose this one." Cleve and his roommate saw the assault from their second-floor walk-up.
So we're going down there. We're dragging people up the stairs. There's blood all over our floors, all over the hallway. I'm like half a block away watching as they just burst into the Elephant Walk bar.
The Elephant Walk was a gay bar on Castro Street. Ruth's friend Amber Hollabaugh was standing right outside it.
She had her back against a flower box that was in front of a bar window. And she said she saw them just come charging with their nightsticks raised, and she just dropped to the ground, and they jumped right over her, through the plate glass window.
We were all sitting at the same table, relaxed, having a cocktail I just ordered around. The police bashed through every one of these windows, billy clubbing, everybody get off the street.
One officer hit a bartender on the back of the head, knocking him unconscious. He didn't wake up for 10 hours.
They were billy clubbing people all the way out through the back door, and there was no way all these people could get through that tiny back door.
They blocked the back entrance so no one could get out.
When they finally got us out the back door, they got into formation and marched saying, "Go home, faggots, go home, faggots."
The people in the bars, a lot of them were the people who hadn't taken part in any of the demonstrations because they didn't feel a part of that movement up until now.
The injuries kept mounting. One victim of the police riot lost his spleen. Another had a ring of fractures all around his head. The beatings went on until Harvey's replacement on the Board of Supervisors, Harry Britt, stepped in.
The police did have no business on Castro Street. Police officers entered that bar in force without any provocation that has been reported to me.
Harry Britt found the police chief standing on a street corner and demanded he get his officers out of the Castro. The police finally stood down. The events of May 21st, 1979, would become known as the White Night Riots. More than 140 people were injured, protesters and police. The next morning, at 7 a.m., Cleve Jones got a phone call.
The mayor wants you in City Hall right now. And oh boy.
The night before, Mayor Dianne Feinstein had publicly condemned the gay rioters as they dispersed from City Hall.
I think it's important for everyone in this city to know that we're not going to continue to tolerate this.
Now, when Cleve showed up at Feinstein's office, he found a whole group of gay movers and shakers. He crept in and sat in the way back.
She's telling everybody that she's calling the National Guard. There'll be a curfew, and the city's going to be locked down. Nobody's challenging her on this, and I'm sitting there thinking, oh my God, the whole city's going to burn if you do that.
There was so much pent-up anger from the Dan White verdict, and the police violence at City Hall and in the Castro only made it worse. Cleve worried that if the mayor set a curfew, all that grief and rage might explode into something much worse than what had gone down the night before.
And then I lied. And I said, I want you to know, Mayor, I have 250 trained peacekeepers who we're going to deploy in the neighborhood. There will be no violence tonight.
Cleve and his friends had been planning a block party to celebrate what would have been Harvey Milk's 49th birthday. It was scheduled for that night. Sylvester, the gay disco icon, was set to perform. So Cleve told Dianne Feinstein,
if you could please keep your police force out of the Castro and let us remember Harvey Milk's birthday. I promise you my 250 trained monitors will keep the peace. And she agreed. And then I had to skedaddle back to Castro and find 250 monitors and train them.
Cleve activated his gay phone tree.
That was my Instagram. I would call 10, they would call 10, they would each call 10.
They took over a neighborhood school, some of them still exhausted from the riots, and prepared to keep the peace. That evening, 15,000 people gathered in the Castro to celebrate their friend and leader, Harvey Milk. Harry Britt told the crowd that the night before had been a great step for the movement, not as a shift from nonviolence into violence, but as a galvanizing moment for a community done with being abused.
Let us say with our new strength that we are tired of dealing with pigs, and that from now on, the people who would follow the spirit of Dan White are going to have to deal with us.
Watching over the festivities were Cleve's newly trained peacekeepers. And from the stage, he brought on Sally Gearhart, Harvey's campaign co-chair and debate partner.
We've been wringing our hands, Harvey, trying to figure what to do beyond the violent fantasies, beyond the rage that we've vented. I would say to you what I've said to you often and what you have said to me, and what Sappho said first, an army of lovers cannot fail.
Happy birthday, dear Harvey. Happy birthday.
to you.
And there was no violence. And Sylvester sang. It's kind of amazing, 30,000 people fighting the police and burning cars and smashing City Hall on one night, and the next night we're having a disco party on Castro Street. But that's how we roll.
We'll be back in a minute. Harvey Milk's birthday party was a beautiful night. But in the weeks that followed, straight San Franciscans were more inclined to focus on the fires and broken glass at City Hall. Ruth Mahaney.
People were saying, well, I was supportive of gay rights before, but now look what you did.
The credibility of the gay community here, many said, was badly eroded, if not destroyed.
You broke all these windows, and now we don't support gay rights anymore.
In a San Francisco Police Department newsletter, the president of the Officers Association compared the violence of the riots to the Jonestown massacre in Guyana. He also said left-leaning gays like Harry Britt and Cleve Jones were demagogues who demonized the police for their own political gain. But it wasn't just the straights and the cops who condemned what had happened. One editor of a gay newspaper said the riot was tragic and terrible and a disgrace to the memory of George Moscone and Harvey Milk. Cleve Jones again.
There were a few people that said, we need to apologize. Let's raise money to replace the broken glass at City Hall.
A lot of the so-called leaders were saying, please forgive us. We just, we were so upset and we were so angry and we didn't mean to do so much damage. And, we're so sorry. Please forgive us. And I was not sorry.
Neither was Cleve. Here he is talking to a reporter a few months after the riots.
Well, it is hard to explain to heterosexuals, but I do not apologize for what happened that night. Part of me didn't want it to happen, and part of me was celebrating, because I knew that nobody would ever again underestimate the rage that we can muster.
In 1984, about 5 years after he was imprisoned, Dan White got released on parole. 1 year later, he died by suicide. As for John Briggs, in 1979, he pulled into a police station and reported that left-wing terrorists were tailing him. There were people on his tail, but they were agents from the IRS, which had launched an investigation into his finances. He was cleared of criminal wrongdoing a few months later, but ended up resigning from the state Senate in 1981, with 3 years of his term left to go. Briggs became a lobbyist, then ran a television station. In 2003, he and his wife moved to a 55 and up community near Las Vegas. After a few years, he decided to run for the board of the Homeowners Association. He really wanted the gig, so he hired a professional pollster to survey the community. Briggs was eager to talk up some parts of his political record. One of his campaign flyers boasted about Prop 7, his successful death penalty initiative. It contained no mention of Prop 6. But then, one of his neighbors published a 4-part expose, a series of blog posts titled Meet John Briggs. It was a straightforward, thoroughly researched retelling of Briggs's whole anti-gay crusade. Briggs was livid and wrote a 3-page response. He called the blog posts an obvious smear designed to make him look like an intolerant person. He also said that while he still admired Anita Bryant as a hero, with the passage of over 30 years, America has changed, including me.
As he got older, he got a little more... No, he didn't. He still was a jerk. But he reflected quite a bit.
By the time John Briggs was running for the HOA board, his son Ron no longer thought they'd done the right thing with the gay teacher ban. He was also on his way to becoming a full-throated advocate against his father's other pet cause, the death penalty. But Ron still hung out with his dad. He actually went to visit him during the HOA campaign, and the two of them stopped in at the community clubhouse.
He goes, "Hey, Mike, why don't you meet my son, Ron?" And Mike turned his back on Dad and walked away. The guy's over there playing pool. "Hey, Tom, Jerry, how you been?" They don't respond. Nobody's responding to him. That 15, 20 minutes I spent with him was the worst 15, 20 minutes of my life because I just felt so bad for him. And he got his ass kicked on that campaign.
John Briggs died in 2020 at 90 years old. 4 decades after the initiative that bore his name and might have made him a star, no major newspaper published an obituary. The gay people you heard from this season, all of them activists in their own way, were young during the campaign against the Briggs initiative. They were in their 20s and 30s, still figuring themselves out as they built this political movement. After the Briggs fight, they pursued careers in education, led projects to preserve gay history, and went into public service. Ruth Mahaney spent nearly 40 years teaching an LGBTQ history class at the City College of San Francisco. Gwen Craig got into Democratic Party politics. Ann Cronenberg worked for the city of San Francisco in public health and emergency management. Tom Amiano won a seat on the San Francisco School Board 15 years after he pressured that board to adopt a policy protecting gay teachers. He went on to serve on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors and in the California State Assembly. Cleve Jones, who led protest marches with a Teamsters bullhorn he inherited from Harvey Milk, now works for Unite Here, a hospitality workers union.
And through union contracts, through collective bargaining, we're winning language that protects queer and trans workers, even in jurisdictions where the local councils will never pass any such thing.
As I was doing research for this podcast, reading books and old newspapers and magazines, I made a list of people I wanted to talk to. People who did big things to defeat Prop 6 or gave cheeky quotes to the press. So many of them, maybe half, had died of AIDS, which began ravaging gay communities just a couple years after the fight against Briggs. Cleve started the AIDS Memorial Quilt in 1985, and every gay person in this story was touched by the crisis.
I lost good friends, 310 friends. I kept a list, and I gave 90 eulogies in 2 years for young men under 40.
When David Mixner and I spoke late last year, he was in poor health at age 77. But he was game. He flirted nonstop with the recording engineer. And it was one of the funniest, most freewheeling conversations we recorded this season. After we wrapped up, he told me he probably wouldn't live to see the launch of this show.
So you got me just in time.
I mean, I hope you go on to live a long life after this.
No, that's not going to happen, but it's okay. I mean, I've had a hell of a good life, haven't I? I'm not sad. I'm not depressed. I'm just glad I could get this to you so my friends can be remembered for their courage.
David Mixner died on March 11th, 2024. These days, we're coming off a stretch of lightning speed progress for LGBTQ people. There's federal employment protections now, gender-affirming care covered by insurance, children coming out to parents, teachers, and doctors, and finding real support. There are more queer and trans people in the public eye than ever, living out a wide range of possible futures. But it's worth remembering what Harvey Milk said after the victory against the Briggs initiative, that he was a sore winner and that gay people can't afford to be complacent. It's a reminder that 69-year-old Cleve Jones shares with every young queer person he meets.
I'm glad you're free, and I'm glad you can get married, and if you really want to join the army, I'm glad you can do that too, I guess. And I'm so happy that your company has a diversity and inclusion policy, and you're rising up the ranks and living your best life as your authentic self. But you cannot take it for granted, because the minute you do, they will take it away.
And sure enough, as the cycle goes, here comes the backlash.
We are witnessing the most unbelievable assault on the sanctity of the family in American history.
Children are being sexually groomed.
Drag story hour at the library.
Transgender insanity.
In Iowa.
In Maryland.
Another recent controversial bill in Texas.
The Parental Rights in Education Bill.
Don't say gay legislation.
No medical care, no participation in school sports for trans girls.
We will make sure that parents can send their kids to school to get an education, not an indoctrination.
Over the past 6 months, I've spent hundreds of hours listening to the people who defeated the Briggs Initiative. It's been a real gift, and it's also been kind of heartbreaking to talk to all these queer elders who stood up in the face of a demoralizing anti-gay backlash and won, only to see the exact same narrative take hold 45 years later. It got me thinking about the promise and the peril of visibility. The way Harvey Milk talked about coming out of the closet, he made it sound like a panacea.
Once they realize that we are indeed their children and we are indeed everywhere, every myth, every lie, every innuendo will be destroyed once and for all.
In the tape he recorded after his election, in case he was ever assassinated, he said he hoped every gay doctor, lawyer, judge, and architect would come out.
That would do more to end prejudice overnight than anybody could ever imagine. It's only that way we start to achieve our rights.
Back then, that strategy made perfect sense. Gay people were isolated and invisible in their own communities, susceptible to myths that made them seem dangerous and morally depraved. Coming out was necessary to demystify gay life for political leaders and voters, the people with the power to grant civil rights or take them away. Some gay people thought if these straight people see how numerous and diverse and productive and loving we are, they'll be moved by our humanity and persuaded by our numbers. That's what comedian Robin Tyler said at San Francisco's Gay Freedom Day in 1978.
And I'm tired of people saying, I can't come out. Yes, they can. If we would come out, there would be no way in hell that they could oppress us. And so I'm wearing a button saying, we are everywhere.
That strategy worked to a point. I believe it played a big part in defeating Briggs. But today, it's clearer than ever that there's a dark side to visibility. Conservatives and even some moderates and liberals are watching all these young people coming out and saying, this isn't right. There's too many of them. Instead of changing their thinking or their politics to accommodate this growing community, they see evidence that children are being groomed and subject to social contagion. Visibility isn't saving these kids. It's being used against them.
Briggs and Anita Bryant's message was we must stop the homosexuals because they are recruiting our children. And it's the exact same message today.
The resurgence of the narrative that drove the Briggs Initiative shows that no progress is permanent. But in the movement against Prop 6, coming out wasn't just about seeking political and social equality. It was also a decision to take control of your own life, to follow your desires and build a sense of self-worth, to surround yourself with a community that knew who you were and loved you for it.
A lot of us, when we first started, were terrified and ashamed and not clear about being proud to be who we were. So we had to fight through a lot of that.
These days, movements for trans and queer youth are a lot less burdened by that internalized shame and fear. Young people no longer have to accidentally stumble across an issue of Life magazine like Cleve did to discover the existence of a welcoming, politicized queer community. It's a credit to the people who defeated Briggs and many others who came before and after that today's trans and queer kids feel ready to commit their own acts of bravery and speak up for themselves.
I believe in our power. I believe in our power.
They don't want us to exist, but we're here and we're not going anywhere.
So much happened in gay America from 1977 to 1979. Anita Bryant and John Briggs, Harvey Milk's election and a coming out movement, defeats in a handful of cities, and a major win against all odds in California. The assassinations, the riots, the coming together one night later for a block party on Castro Street. Those 2 years are a microcosm of queer American history. There's progress and backlash, isolation and community, families lost and families gained, disco and revolt, world-shaking tragedy, and life-affirming joy. There's a speech Cleve gave on the 1-year anniversary of Harvey Milk's assassination. It's stuck with me as I've been making this podcast because it captures the feeling that this story is still unfinished.
We send this message to all the small children growing up queer in a straight world. It will be a long struggle, a very long struggle. And we will have leaders and slogans and martyrs aplenty. But let no one misunderstand. Our movement is powered by the determination of a people too long denied, too long abused. We are deadly serious. We are growing in power with every day that passes, and we will not be stopped.
It's a message that rings just as true now as it did in November of 1979. In queer life, there will always be reasons for anger and fear, but there's no giving up. This season of Slow Burn was written and produced by me, Christina Cauterucci. If you or anyone you know are in crisis, you can contact the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline anytime. Just dial 988 or visit 988lifeline.org. Slow Burn is produced by Sophie Summergrad, Kelly Jones, and Joel Meyer. Josh Levin is the editorial director of Slow Burn. Derek John is our executive producer. Susan Matthews is Slate's executive editor. Merritt Jacob is our senior technical director. We had engineering help from Patrick Fort and Madeline Ducharme. Our theme music was composed by Alexis Cuadrado. Ivy Lee Simones did the cover art, which features an image of Silvana Nova from a poster designed by Larry Hermson and the Too Much Graphics Collective. We had production help from Emily Gaddick, Jude Jaffe-Block, Mike Maines, Cody Schoenberg, Anna Rubinova, Cambra Moniz-Edwards, Jonathan Davis, Jared Downing, Dave Clark McCoy at Studio Pods Media, David Iskandarian, Emily Shaw, Andrew Frankel at Garden of Sound in Los Angeles, Thaddeus Moore, and Women's Audio Mission in San Francisco. Some of the audio you heard in our show comes courtesy of the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender Historical Society. The recording of Harvey Milk's political will is from the Hormel LGBTQIA Center at the San Francisco Public Library. Special thanks to Isaac Fellman at the GLBT Historical Society, Lillian Faderman, Rami Khalil, Fred Fegis, Rachel Strom, June Jones, Linda Mocha Meyer, Emily John, and Deb Greenspan. And Slate's Evan Chung, Madeline Ducharme, June Thomas, Brian Lauder, Katie Shepard, Seth Brown, Katie Rayford, Caitlin Schneider, Alexandra Cole, Joshua Metcalf, Heidi Strom-Moon, Hillary Fry, and Alicia Montgomery, Slate's VP of Audio. Thanks for listening. Hey listeners, our next season of Slow Burn will be here before you know it. Coming this fall, host Josh Levin takes us back to a crucial inflection point in American history. The time when Fox News surged to power and a bunch of people rose up to try and stop it. I, for one, can't wait to listen, so stay tuned.